Okay, yeah. So hopefully you're all warmed up and ready to go. And thank you so much for tonight, for being there and taking care of us tonight, Mike.
I am.
It's all yours.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Unfortunately, with different cameras, I have a hard time remembering which one to look at. And if I look, I've got a monitor that I can see y'all on and see the names, but if I do that, I can't see what my choice is on the screen for the camera view, so sometimes I won't be looking at the right place. But I want to talk about chucking wood. If you can't chuck wood, you can't turn. And I think chucking wood is a function of a number of different things. It's a function of what our value system is. Do we value time or do we value money? Because a lot of times we can buy solutions, but sometimes for some people it's not so much the cost. Some people have limited time and more money, so they'd rather buy a solution. For other folks, the issue is one of they enjoy making the solution. Sometimes there's an issue of safety involved in what type of chucking solution you use. And another one I think that factors in is how often are you doing this and your value proposition. Sometimes it's not so much what it costs as much as you're very frugal and you say, well, I'm just going to do this one time, so I'm going to look at this cheaper operation. So what I want to talk about today, I'm not just going to talk about scroll chucks. That's really further down the list. I'm going to talk about turning between centers, turning where you don't have tailstock support, and that may or may not mean a scroll chuck. We're going to look at some specialty chucking mechanisms, and we'll look at turning off the back of a bowl, the different solutions for that, including a vacuum chuck. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about turning between centers. I've got a lot of notes here, so I'll have to refer to my notes because there's so many things I can't remember. When we think about turning between centers, let me turn to the overhead here. We tend to think of spindle work and furniture parts, but obviously the folks have been turning longer than that. We know spindle work is a lot more than that, because spindle work really means the grain orientation, and it's the grain between centers. It's not just turning, chair, you can't see that, chair parts. Uh-oh, got a throbbing here. I thought I had it turned off. Bear with me here 1 second while I fix that beating heart. Got it. Now it won't be a beating heart. So between centers means you got a drive center and a live center of some sort. Let's set that back down. I like to use a steb center, and a steb center is one of these centers that has these teeth in it. There are several different manufacturers. They're all pretty good. When it comes to a value system, I start off with this cheaper version, this Wood River or Apprentice version, and superficially these look very similar. This is, I think, 7/8, and this is maybe 3/4, but this is a Sorby. This one costs 3 times as much as this one, and as a value proposition, if you turn a lot, you're going to more than get your money's worth out of paying 3 times as much, because this one, they're both spring loaded, but this one, no one ever has a problem with it. The spring is mounted in there in a way that's virtually impossible to get it out. This one is mounted with a spring. If it loosens, this thing comes loose. A lot of times you lose it, and it seems like it's virtually impossible to get it to work properly again. We use this in my club because they're kind of a consumable product. They tend to disappear on us, but they don't hold up as well. The alloy is not as good. The teeth get duller than this, so I really recommend the Sorby one. I've got also a little small one. Yep, pick that up. They don't make anymore. It's a Powermatic. It's a small one, but I like it for smaller type work. I've got a large one I rarely use. I thought I might use this for bowls, but it turns out this does not work very well for bowls because the bowl has a tendency to start spinning, and when it does, this tends to drill a hole through it. But I occasionally use it for larger spindle work, and it was an inexpensive one, so I guess I'm getting my money's worth out. It was only about 20 bucks. other types of centers. Here's one I picked up off eBay. It was a Craftsman. And I guess you could, nowadays they tend to call these safety centers. I think I can probably get you a little better magnification here. Let's see what we can do. They tend to call these safety centers. If you're new at turning, a lot of times something like this is good that doesn't have teeth because it'll just spin if you get a catch and won't destroy your work. You can buy these commercially as well. This one I went back with a Dremel and cut a few teeth so it would be a little handier for me, and I use this on a mini lathe occasionally. And it was a bargain on eBay. Sometimes when you run across a bargain, you get it just because it's a bargain, I think. Other types of live centers or drive centers, the ones that tend to come with your lathe. Usually for mini lathes, you'll tend to get one that looks something like this. It's got 4 spur drives. I think of this as old school. I don't tend to like a four-prong drive. You want to sharpen them. They generally kind of dull. My Laguna came with a 4-drive one. This was for my little Jet Mini that I got when I first started wood turning, a little Jet 1014. But they work fine. The problem with them is, or I say a problem, you've got to pretty much hammer them in. And sometimes that's an issue of hammering in your work. And when you do hammer it in, let me set this aside, you want to take, well, before you hammer it in, let's talk a little bit about marking centers. And because that's the first thing we do before we hammer the thing in. So let's take a small block of wood, for example. There's lots of different measuring devices you can use. You know, this is one from Technitool, and it works fine. The problem that I have is my work is not milled work. It's stuff that I've cut out of a blank of wood and dried out of a bowl blank. You know, it's sometimes kind of trapezoidal, but if you'll extend your finger a little bit and keep it in that same frame of reference, and you make a smaller target by going all the way around, it becomes fairly easy to then take a spring punch. And I use a Harbor Freight, I spare no expense with this Harbor Freight spring punch. Sometimes you got to take it back and get another one, but they'll cheerfully refund your money or give you another one. And that's the easiest way to do it. The other way that I tend to do most of the time, I don't even do that anymore. I tend to hold it under my arm and I look for an imaginary line coming across here, and then I bring my center punch down until it hits that imaginary line. And the more you do that, the more you train your eye. And frankly, I just don't find this terribly useful for me because the wood's not square. If it's not square, what you've got to wind up doing is you got to come around all 4 sides. You've got to press it against, you know, a common side, the one maybe closest to you, and you wind up with 4 marks. And basically, again, it gives you another small target. It doesn't generally give you a dot. It normally gives you a tiny little rectangle. Let's see what this one looks like. It's kind of marked up, but yeah, there's our, we got 2 lines here and a line here and a line here. So our center point is pretty much where I marked it, close enough. The only time that I do something like this, if the work has been milled and it happens to be what I call uranium enriched wood, that is very expensive wood that you've ordered online or picked up at Woodcraft or a symposium that comes from Central or South America or Africa that you're paying $1 or more an inch, then you don't want to lose a single 30 seconds of an inch. Sometimes I do that. The other thing I use, and I use this a lot for irregular wood, and I made this, it's just took a piece of polycarbonate, scribed it, drilled a hole in the middle, used a compass, scribed some holes, put it on a lathe on a faceplate, such as, let me reach up here and grab this. Put it on this round faceplate and then scribed it with a corner of a skew or something similar. And then recently, I went ahead and divided it into thirds and drilled a hole to make it a little easier to mark the feet on a bowl. But this works real well for irregular shaped wood because you can use whatever circle is most appropriate that'll get you the best size.
Come on.
Say again?
Go out. Come on.
Was there a question? Okay. No. So that's so much for marking centers. So we're back to using that those drive centers. So if you get one like this, you got to pretty much put the thing, where you mark the hole, and then you got to get a mallet and just, whack the hell out of it so it sticks pretty good. You cannot normally, especially on a mini lathe, just put it in here in your headstock and drive it on, because you won't get enough friction for it to bite in. Now, old school, I say this is an old school design, and frankly, I think they'd be better off if they delivered two-prong spur drives with every lathe nowadays. This one is the one that came with my Powermatic. Old school was, turning furniture parts. They would take a bandsaw and cut an X, and then those things tended to work fairly well where they fit in wherever I put whatever I did with it, and I set it down, and it just sort of disappeared on me. Anyway, I don't need it again. But anyway, the cross, you put the crosshairs right there where you got it lined up, where you get it cut on a bandsaw. And if you're doing a lot of furniture parts, that's still a good way to do it. And if that's the drive center that you got, then that will work. But you do have to have a way of marking it. Now, when I got my mini lathe, I was kind of surprised. The more I learned about wood turning, the more I chuckled at the things this guy that I got with his mini lathe, where I bought the whole package. One of them was this Veritas center finder, which is a very nice piece of kit. It cost about $30. It's got a sharpened blade here, but for somebody with a mini lathe, I thought, what a crazy way to spend money. But you set it down, and if you got milled lumber, it works very well. You take your mallet and you whack it, turn it again, and whack it. You only have to do it twice if you got milled lumber, but if you don't have milled lumber, and of course this is bandsawed or chainsawed, so it's rough, and I'm not going to get a nice smooth look to it, but I will. If I use the one, maybe. No, that was rough cut too. But you got to have milled lumber for this thing to work. But if you're doing production turning, this is probably an excellent tool. I just think it's a waste of money for somebody with a mini lathe, because it's so much easier to just use a ruler going from corner to corner, or just eyeball it. But again, that goes back to somebody's value system. If they got the money to throw at it, every time they think they have a problem, or the salesperson makes them believe they have a problem, well, there's always a solution for it. Oh, here's the drive center. I hit it right here in the headstock. Now, these fit in what we call a Morse taper, and that's a machine surface that drops. I don't know exactly what the rate is, and there's different machine sizes. The old mini lathes, they were about they called a #1 Morse taper. They're smaller than this. All the modern lathes that I've seen nowadays all have a #2 Morse taper, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's a big Powermatic like I've got here, or whether it's a little jet mini lathe, 1014 with belt chains like I had. But it's important to keep these things clean. They sell a green weenie for about $20, or if you use a shotgun, or you can spend $3 or $4 off Amazon, you can buy a bore cleaning brush. This is bronze, and it will clean the stuff out of here. If you don't do that, and you don't keep your tapers clean, and you get stuff down in here, you can really damage this thing, especially if it rattles around, especially if you're engaging with some very, very large blanks that put some strain on it. I was over helping one fellow turn a handle. He had a big Powermatic, and this thing was just rattling, and it never would get tight, because it turns out he never did center work. I mean, between centers, all he did was big hollow form kinds of things. And I stuck my finger in there, and I thought something was going to bite me. It had these little shards of steel that they call galling, and it's the first time and the last time I've ever seen anything quite that bad. So, but I've seen it in action, and it can really damage your spindle. You can also get a little ding on a Morse taper, and if you do, you want to take a file and gently file it off. or take some fine grit sandpaper with a board behind it and just get that one little spot. Don't get everything else, just get that one little spot. You can generally remove a lot of the damage. Now, there is one other type of drive center that I bought thinking, well, I probably ought to get one of these. I had no reason to get it. And I look back on it now, and I've used it in a couple of videos to show you as an example of something that I don't find terribly useful. And that's a drive center that mounts in your chuck. And again, that's a function of the kind of work you do, I guess. If you turn almost nothing but bowls, and you leave your chuck on all the time, and you only occasionally turn spindles, this might make sense, something like this. You put it in there, pull it forward. The point I'm trying to illustrate is if you've got a piece of wood, let's use something a little smaller here, like this. If you're trying to put I didn't get that in there just right. Chuck key. Figure out where the flats are on here. There's not any flats, so anyway, it should work. You put that in there, and you put this in here. What this allows you to do is when you're roughing this thing and turning it down and you're adding a tenon so you can put this in a chuck, what it allows you to do is you can see exactly how far down you got to size it. I don't see that as a huge advantage for me, because I would rather use a go no-go gauge similar that you could make yourself, you know, something like this. If you got lots of different chucks, you know, which I do use different chucks, so this is only helpful on the normal jaws. You know, I've got others for the different size chucks. The other thing I don't like about it, it's got 4 prongs, which is fine, but the center prong sticks out so far, you've really got to whack this thing, and you don't want to do that on a lathe. You'd have to whack it so hard because it's not real good for the bearings to just be whacking and whacking on this thing. So you'd almost need to drill a hole to make it work. So I don't find that accessory terribly useful for the Nova version. Now, if you've got one and you're using, I have seen people take step centers like this and use the step centers. I'm not sure that that's always a great solution because it's tapered, but actually this part right here is not tapered, but it's not going to hold it real tight either because it doesn't have anything behind it. But I have seen people use one, and they do sell a specially designed one that will fit in here and the chuck jaws will close around it. So that might be effective for some people. The one that's unique set of circumstances I would see where that might be useful for somebody is if they have a chuck that does not have a Morse taper or they've damaged the Morse taper. But I'd hate to always have to use my chuck every time I wanted to turn between centers. And certainly I wouldn't want to always have to use my normal set of jaws. So let me see if there's anything else about it. Got any questions on drive centers before we go forward and start talking about live centers? One of the things, if you're using this center, for example, you could take that and you orient it with the grain, and so it will really bite into it, and that works real well. So it works well on a bowl blank. It works well on a regular spindle blank. You don't want to hit it too hard. The one downside of this, if you're doing spindle stock and if it's real dry and you hit it too hard, you might have a tendency to crack it, and that might be a situation where the 4-prong is actually a little bit better. Now, live centers, that's a whole different story. They used to have, in the old days, they had what they call dead centers, and actually it might have been something similar to this Craftsman. I call this a drive center. Heck, this might have been a dead center at one time. They would have to put grease in here because it didn't turn. They'd put it in their tailstock, and the thing's not turning, so it'd be smoking. Of course, it would be smooth around here. So those are dead centers. Another version of a dead center is this one I picked. I think I picked up this up on eBay. Not sure why. It just seemed like a good idea. That could be a safety center, so it would spin because there's not much holding the wood. Or it could, I guess, be a live center. But most of the live centers had a way of capturing a little bit of grease, and this one doesn't have that. I'll figure out what to do with it one of these days. Now, live centers have bearings. There's different versions. The one that come with your typical lathe have one bearing. And here's the example of one that came with my Laguna 1216. Most of the ones that are original equipment manufacturers look similar to this, and they're not bad as far as they go, but there are some downsides to them. The downside in this one is the way it's configured. You can't get in real close to your work here, and you compare that to, say, the one that came with my Powermatic. I can get down a lot closer to this end for an awful lot of projects before I have to get concerned about hitting the metal. This one, that tends to be a challenge. Now this one, it came with my Powermatic. It's also, you can buy it from One Way. It comes with big jets, and Robust also makes one very similar. It's got a common 3/4 by 10 thread, which allows you to use accessories, and it actually comes with a 60-degree cone, which I have found virtually useless. And the reason I find this useless is because it's out of aluminum. The first time high-speed steel hits aluminum, the high-speed steel wins, and you no longer have a sharp point. You got something mangled. You can see how this has been hit several times, and I've never seen one that didn't have a mangled point on it, and after it's been used for any time at all. It's got this little rod that holds this in place where you tighten it. When it comes out, it's supposed to be able to be used as a knockout bar, which is kind of a joke, because I can poke fun at these people because I can see their shortcomings. You can see how this thing is kind of woogity. That's what I call it, woogity, because I tried to use it as a knockout bar to knock out this center pin. It just doesn't work real well when you've used it for a while, because you're going to get resin and grit and goop in there, and it almost cements this thing in. So to get it out, you've got to really whack it with something hard. You can't whack it. This is supposed to be like a sliding weight. Supposedly this gives enough weight, and you ought to be able to do that, but I've never seen one that works that way. You really got to smack it. The thing that I found that works well, kind of an aftermarket DIY, if you ever replace a sink fixture, a faucet that comes like a bathroom that comes with one of these lift up rods that causes the stopper to open and close, these work great because typically they're made out of brass, even if they're chrome plated, and they fit in here just fine. They give you a nice wide area you can smack with a mallet. Let me see if I can find something to smack this in so it won't go flying around. I'll use this little blank right here. That works good because it's not bottoming out. So if I take my mallet and I smack this thing, you can see I had to hit it pretty hard. It knocks this right out. And there's a time when you don't want to use these, and this is actually a Morse taper as well. I don't know what size it is, but it's got a very slight machine taper that fits into this hole. But there are times when not having a point, especially a lot of times when you're bowl turning and you're making adjustments, every time you crank down to try to get that bowl, that grain oriented, you put a hole in it, pretty soon you got this wide little holes and they all start running together. Whereas if you don't have a point and you've got just this ring, it can secure the wood adequately without leaving the kind of damage that causes it to flow into a certain pre-designated area that you created with this thing. So that's a pretty good one. What I found in lieu of the aluminum one, I bought a cheap one of these things, oh gosh, probably 12 years ago. And I was thinking, and I say cheap, it's a cheap Chinese. And I thought, well, this thing will probably start screeching, the bearings won't hold up. Every time I need a 60-degree cone, this is the one I use, and I've had no problems with it whatsoever. They're anywhere from $18 to $20 or so at Woodcraft, Craft Supply, or Amazon. So if you use a 60-degree cone a lot, this is not a bad deal. I think it's only got one bearing in it, but it seems to hold up. My club uses these because it does work well for a lot of spindle orientation, a lot, but not all. Because it does allow you to get in close, where you can see that, yeah, you can see that. So you can get in here close with this thing. The downside of the 60-degree cone is that it acts as a wedge. And once you start cranking down, you know, some of y'all probably split fire with a big wedge. It will force that wood apart. It also tends to follow the grain. So if you've got some seasonal grain lines in there and you've got hard grain and soft grain, it's going to have a tendency to follow the grain. And the more you crank it down, the looser, the deeper it gets, and your whole piece can get off center a little bit. So it's not a perfect solution for every project. It works especially well, though, with projects that have holes in them, like a twig pot you might be turning between centers after you've already drilled the hole. So there's a lot of things it works real well for. The one that I bought is a replacement, not a replacement, but is to supplement the one that I had, because frankly that 3/4 by 10 to make accessories, you can do it, but it's a bit of an effort because you got to tap a piece of wood. Now that can be done, and I'll have a video out on that before long. You can actually make you a cheap tap out of a 3/4 by 10 bolt that you can get at. You used to be able to get these at Lowe's and Home Depot. I'm not. Yeah, 3/4. I think you might still be able to get them, but if not, you can probably still get them at an Ace Hardware. But basically, to make this tap, let me show you a commercial tap that I just got, because I was trying to tap some HDPE for a project, and I was trying to use this, and it worked. I finally got it tapped, but it turns out there was a lot of memory in that HDPE, and it was really too tight to thread onto something. So I bought a commercial tap. I got this on Amazon. This was Irwin. You might be able to order these from your hardware, from an Ace Hardware store, since they'll order Irwin products. And it was only, I think, about $14. But you can see it's just basically 10 threads per inch, 3/4, same as this, and it's been scored on 4 sides. So if you take a bolt, you can take your angle grinder, your 4-inch angle grinder with a metal cutting wheel, and cut slots. Just make sure for the slot on the left-hand side, the cutting side has a nice sharp edge. The other side doesn't make a lot of difference. And this one, I didn't make it very, very good, but it works. I needed to open up this a little bit more because it's going to collect some shavings in here while you use this as a tap. But you can use that kind of tap or the bolt, because I've used that bolt for a bunch of them, and you use that to make little threaded accessories for something that I first saw Captain Eddie Castlin called a soft touch. This one needs to be rethreaded. It won't go on, and if you don't make it in a manner, this is done many years ago before I really knew how to do it. It needs to go deeper. It really needs to have a slight recess here, so this will fit into it, and so whether this is flat or not, it will still run true. Now, the other way to make them run true is when you put that blank on there that you're threading. Here's another one, and it doesn't. You'll find if you just turn it and tap it and you put it on here, it doesn't necessarily run true. You can always put a penny in here tape it, stick this in there, run it. But when I started doing that, I found it caused this plate, this threaded plate that holds the bearings in, they start coming loose, and I always keep having to keep tightening it up before I finally put some Loctite on it to hold it in place. But it is a nice way to make any number of attachments, and sometimes you need those. Another way to keep from damaging your work is you can take your little block of wood, drill a hole in it, and put that on there, and that's a quick and dirty way to get some support without having to go to the trouble of knocking the pin out, especially if you only need it for a short while. Now, I was telling you about the one that I got to supplement this because I thought it had some nice features, and that's the Nova Live Center, and I like it a lot. It has 3 bearings in it. I believe it's got 3. It's got at least 2 bearings in it. So it runs, you know, theoretically, the 2 bearings will make it last longer and run more true without vibration than that cheap Chinese 60-degree cone I've got. But some of the features, it's got this long standoff, which I like. It also uses a short, stubby Morse taper accessory here. So if I wanted to make a soft touch like Captain Eddie had, you can make one out of wood. And this is a 1/4 inch, so you could hold your pen mandrel in there without having to buy I can go get something called a mandrel saver that you have to pay an extra 15 or 20 bucks for. And this will accomplish the same thing by just making a little soft touch with a hole in it. I made one out of HDPE that really works well for a lot of things. I can bring this up, it won't damage it, but it can give me just a skosh of support. For example, if I'm turning a chess piece and it's a longer piece, longer than a pawn, I don't want to damage the end of it. This allows me just enough support to keep from having to worry about tearing it off of a screw chuck. So that's one of the advantages. The other nice thing about it is it uses a 5/16 inch, got an accessory here, 5/16 inch accessory. You can use a hanger bolt and just stick it in anything and put it on there. You can use that for a big hollow form or something. And to make it run, to turn this true, because it uses a short Morse taper on it. I don't want to get too far, but yeah, we'll be wrapping up on the centers here for long. This short Morse taper goes in there, so you could put your accessory on there and true it up. You know, right here, make sure it runs true. Get that one out. The other thing it's got on it, if you needed some support, but you didn't want to damage the thing, and there's other systems out there that probably have some variations of this functionality at different price points. So it's kind of, you look for what it is you think you need. But this one, it's got a point on it. It's got this long standoff point. It's got this shorter point. Well, I'll put it in here. It doesn't go in there, of course. It goes back here. It's a live center, duh. That makes it a 60-degree cone by sticking that in there. It also, because it uses a common 5/16 inch bolt, you can get the bolt, file off the little numerals that the checkout people need, and put that in there. And then that gives you a chance to have something like a soft touch without having to put a divot from your tip. That will give you some support just with that bolt. So lots of different features. The one thing I don't like about it, for the standard functionality, is this pin is similar to the one problem I have with the Nova. It sticks out too far, but it is removable. You can take this knockout bar and knock that center pin out if you needed to just use the ring on it. So lots of different features. Again, it's a function of how much do you turn, what variety of things to turn, and what it is you need. Oh, one example, let me show you a couple of kind of goofy examples. Sometimes when you're using a live center, and you're doing it on you need to support a returning of a bowl and you can't quite find the center or it's not quite true, you can take a golf ball and drill a hole in it, just 3/4 inch hole, just so it'll slip over. Whoop. And anyway, you got that surface that will tend to support something that's a little bit irregular and give you some support. So that's a technique. That's pretty much the live center. Okay, now we want to talk about, see, that's securing work between centers. Now let's talk about securing work that's not between centers, where you just want to support it. And that's what we typically use a scroll chuck for, but I'm not ready to talk about scroll chucks. We're going to show some other ways to do it. And we're going to start off with the old school method of a faceplate. Let me find my box that's got that stuff in it. Let me move this box over here. I've got a lot of boxes. So the faceplate is kind of old school. This is a 1 inch, came with my Jet Mini. This one is not a whole lot smaller than the one that came with my Powermatic.
What are they? I know there's
Is that a question, or is one of my assistants out there gonna mute somebody? So if you got a question, just unmute yourself. If you got a PC, you can normally hold down the space bar. So there's a Powermatic one, and if you got a Jet 1642, which I always thought was interesting, a smaller lathe, but it had like a 6 inch faceplate. The key to the faceplate, or one of them, is getting the appropriate size screw, and I marked the screw size on here because I couldn't remember. It's a number 12. This one is flat, so you want a screw that has a flat head, as opposed to the Laguna faceplate I got, which I've got it mounted semi-permanently on my little mini lathe over there because I put a handle round knob on the side. I use the faceplate for that. It has a beveled edge, so you need to use a bevel screw. So the key is just using the appropriate one. And based on the work, you may only need 4 screws if it's a small project, but if it's a bigger project, you want to use all of them. If it's a really big project, you need a bigger faceplate than this that has more screws in it, maybe a double row. Let's put that there. This little device, if you had a piece of work and you're trying to center the faceplate on it, what you can do is you've got the center marked. You can either look down on it, or you can actually turn you a little piece like this that fits in that recess, whether it's 1 inch or 1 1/4. Take a little nail and you can just feel it until you hit that. Actually, you had a spot on there. You wouldn't. Yeah, you can just put this in place until you can feel that center, and then just pop take this out, and then mark where you're going to drill the holes. Or you can use the same device if you've got a chuck. Let's say you got a bowl. Let me see an example. We've got a bowl and we forgot to put a dimple in it, or we took the dimple off. So when you're turning it around to true up the bottom and take off the tenon, you don't know where the bottom is. You can center this over you mount this back on your tenon, or it's already on the tenon. You can take this same device, stick it in the back of your chuck, and mark that center with your nail. So lots of little handy ways of going about it. So faceplates. Faceplates are kind of old school, but they're stronger than a chuck for very large work. They do take a little more effort. Don't ever use a drywall screw because they're too brittle. They'll snap. You always want to pre-drill. If you don't pre-drill, I don't have a good example without having to go to the trouble of drilling a hole, but it'll have a tendency to mushroom up little shreds as you drill the hole, or rather, if you don't drill the hole. When you start screwing a screw into the wood, those fibers some of them are going to get pushed up, and they get pushed up in different places. and it'll prevent that faceplate from registering against that flat surface. So drilling a hole with your electric drill will prevent that from happening. Now, another feature, and I'll cover that now, that's similar to a faceplate is what they call a faceplate ring. And I find them to be somewhat pricey unless it happens to come with the particular chuck setup you got. But here's the beauty of a faceplate ring. Basically, it's got a dovetail on it to match, or most of them have dovetails to match the outside of your chuck. And normally they're for a normal chuck. The beauty of these things is if you've got a really heavy blank, if you had a really heavy blank, I'd want to drill more holes because there's only 4 holes. But if you had a really heavy blank and you're struggling to get it up on to your lathe, if it's a faceplate, you got this heavy blank and you're trying to fit it over your spindle and thread it. I've done that before. It's a challenge. But if you've got a faceplate ring on it, you can lift it up and just slip it over, and then that will support the weight. Then you can tighten the thing up. And that to me is one of the nicest features about a faceplate ring, is for heavy work to allow you to mount it without trying to thread something. You can also leave these mounted on your work for a while, but again, they are fairly pricey unless you're making them out of wood, which certainly is a possibility. That's faceplate rings. So if you can make them out of wood, I make glue blocks, but you can make faceplates out of wood. I use these threaded glue blocks for any number of things, and I guess here's one example. This backer plate. This is actually a vacuum chuck, but I use it to support flat work for any number of things when I'm bringing up tailstock support. But I didn't want to dedicate a faceplate to it, so I used a Beal tap to thread it. You get they're fairly reasonably priced. They're cheaper than any other tap you can buy. And let me find my Beal tap and show you what I'm talking about. You drill a 1/8 inch smaller hole, and then you can actually tap the wood. This may be a 1 inch. Yeah, this is a 1 inch. I've also got a 1 1/4. So you can buy one for your mini lathe or your full size lathe, and then you can just crank out lots and lots of threaded blocks. One of the advantages of them, for example, is if you make boxes, if you make you a small investment in a Beal tap, you get to use it forever. And for small boxes, especially if you're doing thread chasing or something where you might take it on the lathe and take it off the lathe, it'll always run true. That's the beauty of it. It always runs true because you might glue the blank to it. But you can use that for any number of different things. And you're going to tap it similarly to the way you're going to tap one of those soft touches. And they're real handy. I've got a video on making one of those things. There are some tricks to it. Not real complicated. You just need to follow the instructions on doing it, because you need to make sure you've got a recess again, so when it slides on here, it will register against your spindle. Otherwise, it's not necessarily going to run true, and you certainly want it to run true. Okay, fastening work. If you're using these blocks, those threaded blocks to put fasten work to, let me find another one in here. Yeah, here's another. Once you make one of these things, you get to use it over and over because you just slap another piece of wood on it. And once you take your project off, you just face it off. And when it gets down real low, you just glue another piece of wood on it. You can fasten your work on here any number of ways. Medium CA glue will work real well. You could put a platter blank, you could put a bowl blank on there. If it's damp, CA glue will work well. If it's not, if it's dry, you want to use a glue gun. If you use a glue gun, make sure you're not using one of these little craft glue guns for $9 from Walmart. You've got to get you one that's like 100 watts. This will heat it up, and it'll do a real good job for mounting an awful lot of things. I don't use it a whole lot because it takes a while to heat up, but also it doesn't have the smell of CA, and that's a plus, because CA has a tendency to cause reactions on people if you get around it too much. So I tend to avoid CA. Another way to fasten some things on there, and let me give you an example of the kind of things we're talking about, is Woodturner's tape. This stuff, a little bit goes a long way. I don't use it a whole lot. This is by Spec Tape. It's a cloth back tape. It's fairly pricey, but this one is 31 inch by 36 yards. I got this when I got my mini lathe, and I've still got it. And I use it from time to time, but I don't use it every day. But it's great for things such as if you're doing a pendant, for example, something small like this. Tape is the absolute best way to fasten it on there because it comes off. It's remarkable just how strong that tape is. And to make it the hole stronger, you bring up some tailstock support, or you clamp it with a clamp. But clamp it for about 10 minutes for maximum strength, and it's just it's amazing how strong that stuff is.
Mike,
Yep.
you prefer that tape over carpet tape?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Well, the problem with carpet tape is there's so many different kinds of tape that may not have the properties that you're looking for. It might seem to work, but it may not, it's not designed to hold a piece of wood, going at 1,000 RPM. And do you want to trust yourself with just any kind of tape? And I just think you're better off getting the turner's tape. Some of that carpet tape, when I say carpet tape, I've got some other tape I use, some double-sided tape I use for sometimes when I'm cutting through 2 or 3 pieces of wood on a bandsaw or table saw, where it's a one-time thing and it doesn't hold it that tight. It'll work for some things like that, but I'm just leery of using it for turning.
All right,
But
thank you.
depends on the tape, and your experience may vary. So I say if you got some and it's cloth backed, then it might be a good candidate. If it's not cloth backed, I just don't think it's going to have the strength. All right, let's talk about screw chucks. That's another way to hold things on the lathe. Again, that's a good thing to use one of these glue blocks, threaded glue blocks for. Here's an example of one I made with a carriage bolt, and I had it mounted on the faceplate. I nipped off the end of the, you can't see that, so let me get that faceplate. So that's what it looks like. I used I say a carriage bolt. This is not a carriage bolt, this is a lug nut. I nipped off the end of this thing with a Dremel or something because I didn't need that tip, and it tapers down. This works fairly well on a lot of things and as an alternative to a Woodworm screw. But frankly, if I want something this big, I'll tend to use a Woodworm screw, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later. But those screw chucks can work very well on any number of projects. And one example that I would use it for is if I'm turning knobs. A screw chuck can be the most effective way and the most efficient way to turn something, because you drill a hole and you screw it in there, and you may have to use a screwdriver finish tightening it up, because a lot of times when you turn this, the screw is turning behind it, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be permanently fastened, but you just put this in there. You use a screwdriver to hold it and pull it tight, but it allows you can size the base with having this little tenon below it, so you can use that to help you size it. You don't have to worry about hitting any metal if you're turning. And I turned an awful lot of knobs one time for a project. I'll show you that later. If you remind me at the end of the demo, I'll give you a 2-minute shop tour on video. But I turned a lot of knobs for my shop storage unit down here, and that's the way I did it, was with a screw chuck, because there was no other way that you could do it as fast. And this was side grain, so it's like turning little bowls. The only other way is you get a larger piece, you turn it between centers, you chuck it, you part it off, but you're parting off not a spindle, but a cross grain, because that's the way I wanted the grain orientation to be. Then you got to remove the damage on the end. So, I mean, it's just not nearly as effective as this, where there's no damage on the end. You screw it on there, it's short, it'll hold it, easy on, easy off. So that's a great way to hold it. The other thing you can use a screw chuck for, one thing about it, you always want to use tailstock support as long as possible. And the screw generally works better, will hold better if it's going through side grain. In other words, this block right here is not, the grain is not running this direction in grain orientation, because it tends to be weaker, a weaker thread. But if you do it this way, it's going to be a stronger thread and hold this screw longer. Screw chucks tend to be specialized, special purpose. Make one for that kind of project where that is the best way to hold something on there. Now we're going to talk about using jam chucks. Jam chucks are one of my favorite ways of holding some projects. The one that most of us tend to be more familiar with, if you ever watch anybody turn a box and you start making boxes, you find out that a jam chuck is almost essential. There are some folks that use jam chucks for returning the bottom of a bowl. We're going to get to bottom of a bowl turning later, but since I'm talking about jam chucks, we're going to hit that now. So for example, this little bowl is dry, and I turn that thing, I don't know, I had it in my first, when I go back and look at a video I made for Gwinnett Woodworkers, I had this same little bowl and chuck in it, but if you tap it, it'll come right out. You line it up with the same grain orientation. In other words, the bowl grain is running this direction. My jam chuck is running in this direction. And this piece right here could be another bowl, a larger bowl blank. So you're using it temporarily. But for smaller bowls, this can be a very effective solution, and actually a better solution than cold jaws or certainly cheaper than a vacuum chuck. And if you tap this thing and get it in place, you know, it'll run absolutely true. Like I say, this thing's over 10 years old. And you pop it loose like that. Now, this has got a slight taper. All jam chucks tend to have a very slight taper, similar to your Morse taper. So in other words, it's going in just a little bit. If it went out, you'd never get anything in it. So it goes out just a little, maybe 3 degrees. So when it just fits, you tap it in, it goes in and it registers against the flat area at the bottom. You want the bottom to be flat. It helps to use soft wood. Poplar is cheap. Poplar makes a very good one. For some projects, heck, you could use MDF and it would work just fine. So there's lots of ways of using jam chucks. Now another jam chuck, if you turn eggs, and I didn't use jam chuck for a long time. I used a Collet chuck, which I'll show you later, but it turns out that if you use a jam chuck, it'll work just great for an egg. so you can finish off the end of it. Now, when you do an egg, normally you don't want to completely finish this edge. This is a finished egg, but you want the piece that was originally on there still here, so you can center it so it'll run true based on, you know, the original orientation. But you can pop that thing out, and this is basically just a hole. Try to continuously put things away while I'm working so they don't stick them. So let me take this loose and show you what it looks like. And this was just an old gnarly, nasty piece of dogwood. It's got a bad crack here, bad crack here, bad crack here. Not useful for anything. I thought, well, it'll probably still do as a jam chuck. And I just drilled a 1-inch hole in it and then put a slight taper in it to match the eggs. And the eggs I turn tend to be a fairly standard size of, I think about 1 3/4 inches, I recall. But it'll work just great. And of course, it'll do either end. But jam chucks work well for a lot of things. Here's an example of a jam chuck. Again, I have a nasty piece of, this is actually a collet chuck. It's got this slice in here. Might have been a crack, but I cut it open with a bandsaw. And I don't have a sample coffee scoop for this, but this is put a coffee scoop in. It's not a way that I felt comfortable with, but that's one way you could use a jam chuck. Let's see. Any questions about jam chucks? They look like they're a lot of work, but I tell you, the more you use them, the faster and easier it gets, and it's so standard to use it for a box. Let's see if I have a box. I don't think I got a box blank here. Yeah, so let me just show you. So basically, okay, we got our box blank, and you know, we turn it between centers. We decide which end's going to be the lid. That's the part we chuck in here. We part it off. We turn off the center, and we go ahead and make the walls parallel, and we take that off. Then we turn our tenon to fit that. We put this in here, and then we turn it to a very tight fit so we can finish off the top of the lid. And you've seen this probably done several times, but that's an effective use of jam chuck where you're actually using the bottom of the box for the jam chuck. Now, then to finish off the bottom, you get some scrap, some spindle scrap, and I keep a box full of them. When I do a spindle project, when I have some scrap with a tenon on it, I throw it in a box because I can always use it for a jam chuck. So I put it in here, turn it down, your box wall is going to have parallel walls, and that's how you finish off the bottom of the box. And that's the most common way that most people are familiar with a jam chuck. Jam chucks are primarily for finish turning, not rough turning. It was a real common method before scroll chucks were readily available, when people, I think, got more used to doing it. But it's still a great tool to have in your toolkit, to have that as an option, because you never know when it may be just the perfect solution. And of course, one of the things we didn't talk about, anybody's watched several people do box demos, you've seen this happen when they try to get these things to fit and they overshot it and they don't get a really good fit. You can always put a piece of paper towel, or as the Aussies and the Brits called it, kitchen paper. If this is too thick, you can use a toilet tissue. If that doesn't work, you can spray it with a mist of water to swell the fibers a little bit and use that. So you can make it fit pretty well. And then if you needed to make it secure, you can always wrap tape over it when you get it together. All right, movable jaw chucks. That's basically scroll chucks. But before we talk about scroll chucks, let's talk about one of my favorite movable jaw chucks. I don't use it as often as a scroll chuck, but I tell you what, awfully handy, and that's a collet chuck. There's basically two kinds of collet chucks. There's your store-bought metal collet chuck, And there's a nice, right now, we're all suffering from supply chain disruption because of COVID. So some of these things that ought to cost $100, you look on Amazon, it might cost $168. This one is a 1¼ inch from Craft Supply, costs $100 when it gets back in stock. I doubt if they have it available right now. And it's just been real handy. It uses an industry standard collet they call an ER32. There's different kinds of collets. I'm not a machinist. I've learned all this since I got into wood turning, but it's a standard collet chuck that pops into place. It comes with about 5 different sizes, and it is designed to hold round things. And it holds round things very well because it squeezes it with a ring of metal, so it doesn't damage your work. So any dowel or anything you turn perfectly round that you can fit in a collet, this works great. Now, if you only have a 1-inch spindle on a mini lathe and you don't plan on upgrading, you can get one that looks virtually identical to this. It probably comes out of the same factory for $100, but I would recommend getting the Craft Supply one for the same price because it comes with a spindle adapter. It comes with, actually, it comes with a threaded insert that fits right inside here. It doesn't stick out a whole lot, and then that will fit on a 1-inch mini lathe. So I think buying the 1¼ is a better deal. And then if you upgrade your lathe later, you take this out. And if you've got 2 lathes like I do, this is a handy accessory to be able to convert my any 1¼ if I happen to have a particular chuck that's got a set of jaws on it that I want to use on a mini lathe, I can just thread this thing in there and I'm in business. And it doesn't stick out as much while we're talking about movable. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But the collet chuck is real handy. Uh-oh, that wasn't pretty. These chucks aren't designed to be thrown down on the ground. So they use something called Tommy bars, sticks in. This has got a knurled. There's also a more expensive one by Beal, which is made in the U.S. This thing's made in China. The Beal one is probably better machining, probably better quality, but frankly, this one meets my needs just fine and is cheaper. And I like the fact that the tightening nut here is knurled. Most of the time, I don't even have to take a set of Tommy bars to tighten this thing up. I can just hold on to the hand wheel and hold on to that knurling, and it'll hold it plenty tight. Now that's one set of collet chuck. There's another commercial collet chuck, and frankly, I don't know what you call it. I don't know what the collet size is. Somebody out there may know, but let me get that for you. And that's the one that you typically use if you get a threading jig. It uses a slightly different design. It is a Morse taper, but it uses a drawbar to pull it in and to tighten it down. So what I got that for, or it came with a threading jig, so it holds that 3/8 inch shank rotary cutter, and then you use this, you make you a drawbar with coarse rod. This is forget 16 threads per inch, 3/8, I think, and it pulls it tight to hold that cutter. And believe me, when that cutter going 2,500 RPM, you want that thing to be held tight, not come loose. But it's also great for any type of small project of a certain size, and it's cheap. If 3/8 will get you there, then it works. I'm looking for, I have a little blank of wood here somewhere to show you how that thing would fit. But in any case, 3/8 inch. You can get these in different sizes, but by the time you get different sizes, you might as well get you a real collet chuck that doesn't require a drawbar. But I use that collet chuck not a lot, but when I do use it, it is super, super handy. Now, the other type of collet are the wooden collets, And they're kind of fun. Let me get to some of those here. Let me set this thing down. My pink barf box here. Here's an example of a collet. This one I got from former YouTuber, rest in peace, Bob Hamilton. And basically, you take a block of wood, you drill a 1-inch hole, you turn the outside, you cut some slots with a bandsaw, and this is especially designed for making napkin rings because it's fast and easy. And if you're making a lot of napkin rings, you want something that's fast and easy. And that's where some of these DIY kinds of projects are so handy. I don't have a sample, but imagine a block of wood with that's got a 1.5-inch hole in it that slides on. Then you bring up your cone and it just opens it up and snugs it down. And then you shape the outside of that ring. That's just one example. And this one I glued on there with hot melt glue, and it's again a threaded glue block out of I don't know, cherry, I think. And it works great. Now, other types of collet chucks. Here's an egg cup. I saw this plans for this on the internet somewhere. And if it's on the internet, you know it's got to be true. Well, this was kind of cockamamie. This wasn't real effective. You'd hold this in your chuck jaws. You got all these little slots on it. You put an egg in there, and then you have to use a screwdriver and really clamp down on it. And meanwhile, you got this pipe clamp coming around that's kind of scary. And I got it backwards. No, I don't. Yeah, you want it with the sharp edge coming, kind of passing you. It worked, but frankly, it does not work as well as that wooden jam chuck. Here's another example of a collet. Let me get, and this is, if you were going to make a 1-piece coffee scoop and you didn't want to go to the trouble of making a donut chuck, which I'll show you here shortly, you can make you a collet chuck to hold it for doing the final hollowing out of the bowl. And you just match it to your project. Have a big open area here, clamp it down, and off you go. So that's an example of a collet. If you're frugal, you don't turn very often, and you've got a project that's just a little bit smaller than these jaws will handle, again, make you a 1-piece, a one-time use or maybe multiple use, but just take you a spindle blank, hollow it out, turn a tenon on it, part it off, run it through your bandsaw, and there's your collet for a smaller piece of wood. And you size it, of course, to fit the piece of wood. Now, the downside of a collet is you have to be very precise in your measurement. If you're doing but not as precise as a jam chuck. If you're doing a jam chuck, you have to be precise, I think, to about 1/64 of an inch. If you're making a 1-piece collet chuck like this, and this slot is, let's say, a 1/16 of an inch, then you've only got to be accurate to a 1/16 of an inch, and you can tighten that thing up. So you've got a little bit of room for play with a collet chuck. I have seen people that'll take a collet chuck and they'll make 2 or 3 pieces and fit it in, so they get it uniformly centered. This one could throw you off just a little bit, but not enough to make a difference. Now here's an example of a little shop-made collet chuck. This idea came from Mark St. Ledger up there in, I think, Virginia. This is out of poplar. You just open this recess, have a hole in it, cut a slot in it, and this is to finish off the top of a little box lid. And it's a it's a kind of lid that you couldn't mount it snugly in the box because it's not shaped that way. It's supposed to be kind of loose. So you make this little collet with a very, in this case, I would have parallel walls, and this will work like a champ. Then you can finish off that bead by using that wooden collet, and you couldn't easily do this some other way. You can't use tape on it because this end has already been kind of hollowed a little bit. You can't put it in a chuck without leaving marks on it, but a collet chuck, perfect fit, leaves no marks, works like a champ. And I use that one from time to time when I make those kind of boxes. Here's another poor man's collet chuck. I think this was for a different set of chuck jaws. But again, similar to the other one, except it's wooden. It uses a pipe clamp with a bunch of slots to do an egg. But again, this kind of scares me, and I don't. And it is more effort to use this thing, whereas the jam chuck that I showed you earlier, you can make it different sizes. You can adjust it for slightly larger eggs. It just pops in. It's definitely the easiest way to use it, to use a collet. Another way to use a collet, this is the example I was really looking for. If you've got a normal set of jaws, you don't have a smaller set of jaws, you don't normally need smaller jaws, but you've got that one little project, and it may not look like this. This is just an example. You put that in there and tighten down. It's not tightened like steel jaws, but let me tell you, that's got a pretty tight grip on it, and it's going to run very, very true. So it's one of those things you just want to file it away in your memory. Use it once or twice, and there may be a time when something comes up that it's a perfect match. Now, here's another example. Let's say you're turning a ton of birdhouse ornaments for Christmas, and you're getting into production mode, and you want to turn 100 perches. The thought of that just kind of gives me the willies, but I think this is a Morse tape. No, this is not a Morse taper. I'd have to put this in a chuck. This is not the best example because I've got a spindle adapter on here that doesn't have a hole on it, but let's imagine it's got a hole in it. If I hadn't told you, you wouldn't have known. Let's see if it'll tighten up. But basically, you make a little collet chuck, and you're using bamboo skewers that might be, 12, 15 inches long. And you got this very simple collet. The trick is you have the bamboo skewer that's very, very small. It goes all the way back down into your spindle. And you turn off a perch, loosen it up, pull it out a little bit more to the next one, tighten it up, turn off the next perch. You can put a little knob on it, you can turn it down, but you can see how this concept, you can take a long rod that's less than, no more than about, half an inch or so, the inside of your spindle, and you could just keep doing something. It might be a situation where, so that's an example of a production way of doing it. So some of these techniques can work real well in production where it's hard to come up with a commercial, a fast and easy and inexpensive commercial solution. All right, let's talk about scroll chucks. Scroll chucks are fairly modern invention. I think they dated from the early 80s before I got into turning. There's several things I want to talk about. I want to talk first about some features of scroll chucks, one to another, and that's, figure out how to get this thing off. I'll get a tummy bar. One feature is how do you tighten it up? And some of these things, here's a little tool I use for grabbing this thing sometimes when this thing gets kind of snug, and it's a spud wrench or slip and lock nut wrench. It's a sorry, crude wrench, but it does tend to work for this thing because you're not using it a lot, and you can get it to fit on a lot of these different kinds of adapters. Or you can use slip lock pliers as well. So the first thing is, how do you put it on your lathe? Well, you screw it on. Some of them, the smaller ones, typically for mini lathes, are direct threaded. And the advantage of that is they run perfectly true. There won't be any run out because they don't have an adapter. Plus, they save about $20 in the manufacturing process in that you don't have to buy a separate $20 to $25 adapter to fit your chuck. Now, the downside is it is whatever you bought. And then if you want to use it on another one, for example, this is a 1-inch, you can buy a spindle adapter. Now, the problem with a spindle adapter, anytime you add extra fitting, you increase the chance of some run out, a little bit of wobble. Normally this stuff, if you buy quality stuff, it's going to be minimal, but there is a risk. Also, you may have to tweak it. This one, I don't know if you can see the rough edges. I had to grind this thing down. It's kind of embarrassing. I took this thing, I was going to use a Jet 1442 in a demo. I had my spindle adapter so I could use my chuck. Now, let's see. No, that wasn't it. That's a different story. I remember what it was. I was using it with this precision MIDI. And I put it on here. And I started tightening the jaws. And they would only get so tight. And what happened is this spindle adapter was a little bit longer than it needed to be for that jaws when they designed this thing. I guess it didn't fit every single chuck at the time. And the spindle adapter extended into where we would normally have the threads. And I think you can see that now when I take this thing off. Maybe. But that spindle adapter, after I ground off the end, just clears the jaw glides, just clears them. So that's the kind of thing you sometimes run into with spindle adapters. I bought some inexpensive PSI spindle adapters for my club, and I found that most of the 1-inch chucks we had would not register here. And it's because this part right here was not sized properly, and I had to wind up machining this away on a wood lathe. And I'm not a machinist, but I finally had to do that. And I was just kind of surprised that I'm sure Penn State's had those complaints over the years, and they haven't gone back to the manufacturer and improved on them. But it was an inexpensive adapter. Now, so you've got spindle adapters that go from one side to another, and depending on what size you're going for, you might have this adapter insert, and this is better than this, but this is to go in the other direction. This goes from a 1-inch to a 1 1/4, so they can make it thin because it doesn't extend out very far from the lathe. And the further out you go, the more any error in manufacturing is going to present a problem. So this one theoretically is going to be have a less potential for run out, except this was made by Pyromatic and this is made in China for PSI or Craft Supply. But this has been a real handy thing to carry in my toolbox when I go on demos and I need to use a different chuck. Now, different chucks use different methods for threading. I have a great big Titan chuck, and it's direct threaded for 1 1/4. So you'll find a few like that, but most chucks, you buy the adapter for that particular chuck. Now, I was originally a Nova guy. I had 4 Nova chucks, and I had all 4 of their models. I had the Precision Mini and the G3 and the Supernova 2, and then their older Titan, and I was happy with them. It's good quality, they're good value, but all right, here's these two chucks that look virtually identical, except one is a record power chuck and one is a Nova chuck. They both have indexing, but differences. They both have a back plate. They both have the same weight, same size. The Novas register, their spindle adapter registers on the inside, and you'd look on forums, but every now and then you'd run into a newbie that says, "Oh, I got this Nova chuck, and it's got all this run out. I got a bad chuck." No, they probably didn't get a bad chuck. It's so hard to tighten it down. They didn't tighten it down enough where it registered at the very back of the inside. And that registration, that is those two surfaces, flat surfaces coming together, are critical for it to run true. The record power on the other hand, registers on the outside. And it's so well machined, it just goes schnick, 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 and boom, you're there. So I really like the machining and the design of the record power inserts. Other than that, the chucks are very, very similar. I think the record power's got a slight edge in manufacturing precision and quality, and I do like that, the way that insert works. But some of the one way has a different style insert. I've never had to mount one of those, but it's some kind of slip fit with some screws that tighten it up, and it's supposed to be very, very, very precise as a way of doing it. The other feature of chucks is, let's compare, in this case, a G3 chuck with this record power Supernova 2 equivalent. Generically, chucks either have a back, a covered back, such as the Vic Marks, I think all have these covered backs. Some chucks have open backs. I would not say that a closed back or a sealed back is better than an open back. They're just different. You do have to blow these out occasionally, whereas these may not need cleaning for your lifetime, or they might, but you'll have to take it apart to clean it out. They're just different. The Stronghold is a very, one-way Stronghold is a very, very well-made chuck, gets a lot of kudos, and it's got an open back. So I don't think that's a big deal. It's just something to be aware of, that there is a difference. But I categorize chucks as basically two different style chucks. There's what I call the main line, or the high first tier chucks, I'll call them, and that would be your one way, your record power, Axminster. There's only one place in the U.S. that sells them, but they have very high quality products. The Sorby Patriot chuck, the one-way chucks, Axminster, the Vic Marks. Then you get all the second-tier chucks, and then the second-tier chucks are the house brands, ones sold by PSI, or such as the Barracuda. And I did a video on this a while back, and one guy just, I called his baby ugly, and he felt real frustrated because I said his baby was ugly because he had a Barracuda chuck, and he took offense. But the fact of the matter is, they're cheaper for a reason. They have a lesser quality design, or they have less customer support. They have a smaller warranty, or the biggest thing about it, they don't have the same alloys, and they might work fine for a while. They might work fine for the weekend warrior that only turns 4 or 5 times a year, and they might last his lifetime. But if you turn a lot, like I do, then after a while, whatever that while is, whether it's months or years, those alloys start wearing on these scrolls, and you start getting play in them, and pretty soon they're just not gonna hold up. So it's like everything else, you tend to get what you pay for. The key thing is, it pays if you can figure out what chuck system you want to get and stick with it, because once you start getting bunches of them, you don't want to have multiple variations of different ones. Now, the other feature of chucks is generally you cannot interchange one set of jaws from one manufacturer with another, except there are a couple of minor exceptions. Actually, you usually can't even change jaws from one model number to a different model number in that same by that same manufacturer, with some exceptions. So that's something to keep in mind. The biggest exception is in these Nova and Record Power and Robert Sorby. They all use the same fittings. The screw holes, the same size. The screws are the same. The little ring, here's an example. They have this little machined groove here where the back of the jaws will fit in this little registration place to help secure it. Not only is it the screws, but it's also this little groove. They're all virtually identical. Nova says, oh no, you can't use any other manufacturer. Well, of course they're going to say that. They want to sell all their own jaws. Record Power says, well, if you use Nova jaws on here, alternate the 2 and the 4 because ours is righty-tighty, theirs is righty-loosey, and as a result, because of the way that scroll ring is manufactured and the way it works, you've got to reverse the 2 and the 4 so it'll run true. But other than that, they're virtually interchangeable. Same thing with Robert Sorby. Those jaws are interchangeable. The general rule of thumb is big chucks and big jaws for big projects, smaller chucks and smaller jaws for smaller projects. The other feature about some of these is what do the jaws or what is the scroll key look like? How does it work? Well, you've got this precision MIDI that uses what they call Tommy bars, the same kind of bars that I was using on the Collet chuck. They fit in these holes. This is a very well-made chuck. It's a very simple design by using this technique. I hate it. It was recommended to me by a friend that said this is great for a mini lathe if you're traveling, it doesn't have a lot of weight. I can hardly use this thing without dropping 1 or more Tommy bars more than just once when I'm using it. But they are high quality, they work well. It's just I have a tendency to drop these things, so I don't much care for that design. It's a cheaper manufacturing design, so there are lower production costs, so you pay a little less for it, but it can be still be a good chuck. That's one style. The other style, and best example, is Vicmark and the Supernova 2 and the Record Power and the Novas and the Patriot. They use an Allen key, and they work very well. And the Nova and Record Power, and I think the Patriot, they come with a ball joint on the end of it that theoretically enables you to be able to tighten it with it extended out to the side like this. So if you had a bowl on here that wrapped around, you might be able to get underneath that thing and tighten it. Frankly, I don't do that kind of turning. This is not a real good feature for me, and what it winds up doing is it prematurely wears out this pintle. Now, the good news is this is a replacement part. You can order these parts if you do wear them out. But I find it's better to take a hacksaw or a Dremel and cut off that ball because you're going to have a much snugger fit and you're less likely to wear these things out in your lifetime. But that's a personal opinion. And it comes with my guarantee. If you break it, you got to fix it. Now let's talk about jaws. And we don't want to spend too much time talking about jaws because I've got other things to cover. There's lots of different jaws out there. Get the jaws that you need and that you can afford, depending on how much you turn. Here's an example. I wished I'd bought a set of these jaws a long time ago. This is Record Power. And I was fortunate. I have these 2 Record Power chucks, and then I have all my Nova chucks. And Record Power was nice enough to strike an arrangement with me in exchange for me including their product in a couple of videos. They gave me their 2 Record Power chucks, the equivalent of Supernova 2 and the equivalent of the G3, and every jaw set they make. So I already had some of the jaws that were Nova, so I sold them off. Because I believe that the Record Power, one of the features I like about Record Power, and it's trivial, they put the number on the face where you can easily see it as opposed to on the side or on the back of the jaws, like Nova. That's one of the features. But this particular jaw set, if you do lots and lots of bowl turning, this is a nice jaw set. I think they call it, the Nova calls, I think they're 75 millimeter jaws. I don't remember what Record Power calls it. They usually use excess words like super duper, grabber, holder, for big bowls or something. But because it's got this very large face, it really holds stronger because the strength you get from a jaw set is not from the sheer clamping power. It's the mechanical fitting of the flat area where it won't rock, and it won't rock because it's held in place by compression or expansion. And that, so this is a very, very strong set because the size of this face compared to their standard jaws is significant. So this could accommodate a much larger one. Generally, jaws, you want to make sure that you are turning your fitting on your piece, say a bowl, to fit the design of your particular chuck. That means if it calls for a parallel tenon, make a parallel tenon. Don't make a dovetail. If it calls for a dovetail, don't make a parallel tenon. And that sounds awfully basic, but I was in a workshop. I was assisting Harvey Meyer in a workshop, and he had Nova chucks, and he talked about, and he mentioned the word dovetail at least once. Everybody in there was using, as a woodcraft, was using a Nova chuck with their standard jaws, and we were using a tenon. Because he used the word dovetail at one time, but he told them to make a parallel tenon. 2 out of the 8 people in there made a dovetail tenon because they didn't understand what he said. And it's interesting to me how there are a lot of people that they either don't want to listen or they don't care, or they don't think it makes a difference. But some of these things make a big difference when you got something whirling around your face at 1,000 RPMs that weighs a couple of pounds. You want it to hold. So let's talk a little bit about that holding, and let me give you an example. The question comes up, what's the better hold, a recess or a tenon? Well, some of my friends say it's a recess, and other of my friends say it's a tenon, and I agree with my friends. I think they're both fine. The key is do it right. So here's an example of a cutaway, and let's see if we can't go back to a little magnification here. Okay, so there's a cutaway. So in this case, the 2 important features, the outside of this is a dovetail, so you want to cut that dovetail to closely match this. Doesn't have to be spot on, but it needs to be close. Also, you want the face of the chuck, ideally, it will register on the bottom, but that's right here to give you that strength, not only of the expansion, but the registration against the face of it. And you want to make sure you've got enough wood on the outside right here so you don't blow this out, because you can, if you get that in there and crank down with everything you got on a recess, unless this thing is massive, there's a good chance you can blow it out. You don't have to crank it down as tight as you can, but it needs to be snug to hold up. I generally do not use a recess except on platters, because for me, I find it easier to turn a bowl to match the inside and the outside and take off the tenon. But that's just a personal preference. It's not the only way to do it. Both of them can be effective. Now let's look at the right way and the wrong way of holding this. And let's see here. This is kind of an extreme example, but that's okay. Kind of exaggerates it. One of the keys to a tenon is it can't bottom out. It does not have to be all that long. So we get one like this, and it fits, and you can clamp down on it. But here's the problem. Because it doesn't have the face of the jaws against this shoulder, it has very little strength, and it will leverage out, because when you put some pressure on it, the bottom actually is leveraging, and eventually it's going to fail on this particular set of jaws. You want this thing to, I think this is, the other one's probably 35 millimeter. You want it to be, maybe a quarter of an inch. Doesn't need to be much longer than a quarter of an inch. And the longer the tenon is, the bowl tenon, the harder it is for you to get it faced properly. Here's an example of one that goes on my Titan chuck. It's not too terribly deep. That's probably, might be 3/8 of an inch in this one, but it's a pretty big set of chuck jaws. That's more than enough for that particular dovetail tenon. I like the Nova and the Record Power and the Patriot normal jaws because they call for parallel tenon, and a parallel tenon is just, to me, faster and easier than a dovetail on a tenon. I understand the need for putting a recess, dovetail recess, because almost all recesses, with the exception, use the one-way Talon, it uses a parallel on the inside and the outside. But you don't want this thing to bottom out. You want it to fit around here, because that's where you get your strength. Okay, some other examples of jaws. I like this smaller set of jaws that Nova doesn't make, but Record Power and Robert Sorby does. So if you got work that's just smaller than your typical 2-inch that could be held in your normal jaws, the 35 millimeter jaws handle all those slightly smaller projects for coffee scoops and ornaments and baby rattles and any number of things that if you turn it perfectly round, you can't get a shoulder on it. You might be able to tighten it up, but you don't have that shoulder to register against. So I like the 35 millimeter. Nova doesn't make, they have a 35 millimeter spigot jaws, but it doesn't operate the same way. And you have the pen jaws, which to me is a great deal for the manufacturer. They cut a set of jaws. You know, the jaws are made out of a big block of steel, and then they cut them. So in this case, they cut them and they wound up getting to sell it, one pair for one guy and the other pair for another guy, and still charge you like they were giving you 4 sets of jaws. But this is great for drilling pen blanks. It's also great. I use it a lot for drilling for fan, when I'm doing fan pulls. That it works great for that. Then I've got a long set of jaws that I don't use very often. It's kind of a special purpose. This thing got a 1-inch thread on it, so I have to use my adapter, which I can do. I'll put it on the chuck. The design for these longer jaws basically are so when you are doing a bowl, you can get it further away from the chuck face. Now, I'm not sure when I would ever do that, or it's an issue, but an example might be if you had a deeper bowl and for whatever reason you were holding it with a recess or a tenon on the inside of the bowl, but if you can imagine, then the bowl is coming out over the chuck jaws a little, the chuck a little bit, where the normal jaws that wouldn't work. It also gets you further away from the headstock, so you can get behind the bowl, which is probably the biggest advantage to it. For some people that might chuck it one time and do the inside and the outside, you can get to it. Other than that, these are kind of special purposes. I don't use these very often. Don't find them terribly useful. But while I got them, let me give you an example. I think these will work. The trick about sometimes on some projects is problem solving. That's one of the things I like about wood turning is problem solving. And nope, that won't work. That solving that problem is figuring out how do you hold something on the chuck when it has to go back on the chuck and you didn't expect it to go back on the chuck and you don't have a way of getting it back on the chuck. That's kind of a conundrum, but if you make some of your projects with that in mind, there are ways that you can put it back on the chuck. And here's an example of one. I did this the other day. I did a coffee scoop in a demo, and I didn't have time to really hollow it out, make the walls just perfect in the amount of time I had. So I had this bowl for this coffee scoop, and I'm thinking, well, it's a pretty piece of wood, but it's too clunky to use. Well, guess what? I was able to put a jam chuck on it, put it on a jam chuck, and take a point tool or the corner of a skew, make this tiny little groove. And that's all it is, tiny little groove. And because of that tiny little groove, I was able to put this back in right there on that little, what Record Power or somebody called a hawk beak. It's not a true dovetail, it's a micro or a mini dovetail. And that held it strong enough for me to finish hollowing it out so I could salvage it. And all it took is this tiny little groove. So that's just an example. Richard Raffin, I've got one of his, he was nice enough to give me permission to use one of his articles and put it on my website. It was on chucking. Fabulous article where he talks about the different types and styles. And one of the comments he makes is nobody needs more than 11 chucks. And that's because he has 11 chucks. But here's an example. Here's an example of a little saucer I make to put threaded acorns on. You can see this tenon is just tiny. It's barely a 1/16 of an inch, but it's big enough that I didn't have to turn it away, but I just left it on there, whereas I wouldn't normally do that on a bowl because I think it looks kind of clunky. But I was able to finish the inside and decorate it because when I turned it with the expectation of sizing this just right, and sizing it just right is important. When they make this, I said they turned out jaws out of one block of steel, and then they cut it in half, and they've cut away that metal. So the perfect size is one where the metal touches all the way around by getting as close to that original design. This one's a little bit big, and if you look at these, you'll see tiny little marks on it that aren't an issue for this. But if I made it just a little bit smaller, you wouldn't see it. It'd almost be like a collet chuck where you got metal contact all the way around. Now here's another example of a tiny little ring bowl, and I want to finish it off. How's the easiest way to hold it? Well, I could make a jam chuck. It's not very big to hold on a vacuum chuck. There was a couple of ways, but the way that I used was I sized it to fit my Titan chuck. I don't want to drop this thing because it would smash my toe big time. This sucker is heavy. This is kind of about the size of the stronghold, probably pretty close to similar. So this has got a true dovetail. Because I've got this tiny little bead, I can put this in there and just fit it around that bead. And there I go, and I can turn off the bottom without any trouble. So a lot of it is just thinking ahead and planning your project for the jaw set that you've got. Or if you have a decorative groove, a lot of times you can find a way, if you got multiple jaw sets, to get it back on the lathe. Yeah, another example of that I think was this awl. I've got this little design feature here, and this will go on those long jaws and clamp down right here, which is important for being able to decorate. Some people like pins. I like turning awls. I like to do some texturing on the outside, but it's good to have a way to hold the wood. I have held it with the ferrule, but it's just not as neat and clean. The other thing, it's interesting how the different manufacturers will have a different idea of what is a good idea or a bad idea. Let me give you an example. So here's a Nova chuck, a G3, and if you look at the instructions, they say one of the ways you can hold things are just with the jaw glides. Record Power, who's, like I said, has a virtually identical set of chuck and jaws, say, no, don't ever do that. Well, I tried this for this demo years ago, and it can work. The key to it for this to work is it can't be a very big piece, and it has to be perfectly square. This piece, I've noticed when I played with this thing today, is not perfectly square. And as a result, when I clamp down on it, I can't center it. There's a gap on one side and not as much of a gap on another. So even when I bring this thing up with a live center, like I showed you, that has maybe a Captain Eddie soft touch like this, you know, I could center it and kind of hold that in place, but it's still not necessarily going to run true here because it wasn't milled properly. So you need to have perfectly milled squares, or you need to round this. If you made it round, it might fit. And I think they say up to 5/16 of an inch, so something not very big. But there's two different manufacturers. One say, yeah, this is a good idea. The other one says not so much. But the same, going back to the same manufacturers, one of them in their documentation says this G3 chuck, you can, with the normal jaws, you can turn a 12-inch bowl. Record Power says the optimum bowl size, using a ratio of 1/3 the base to the bowl size, the optimum size is like 6.5 inches. It's like, well, that's crazy. That's the biggest you can make. A bowl is a little over 6 inches with a 50 millimeter normal jaw set. So it's strange. Now let's talk about one of my favorite chucking mechanisms or methods is the Woodworm screw. A lot of people don't like this because it's like they tried to skew one time and they escaped back, so they put the skew down and said, oh, I don't want to do that. Well, Woodworm screws sometimes are the same way. And the Woodworm screw is just like the screw chuck, except almost every chuck comes with one. In my case, the Titan even comes with one. And it has the same amount extending past the jaws. It's longer because it uses, you know, it's got deeper jaws than the normal jaws, but they're other than that, they're virtually identical. And here's another one of those things where the manufacturers will have different instructions, and sometimes the instructions are just flat goofy. Now, I won't say which one's right or wrong on using just the guides, but I would say on this one, Nova wins. It's got a flat area here, and that's, you line that up with the jaw guides or carriers, and you pull it forward. And you pull it forward so it registers against the back. Because when we take a big old screw blank, let me show you. I've got a sample. All right, so we got it tight. The other trick we're going to do, it helps, is we're going to rub a little paraffin on it. Makes it easier to thread on and thread off. Always keep a little piece of paraffin handy. We're gonna use a big blank. I've been saving this one to make a stool out of. So I've drilled the appropriate size hole based on your chuck. Different chucks, Woodworm screws. One might call for a 5/16, such as the Nova. The one way calls for the next size up. That's, I think, a little bit less than 3/8. But you put it on. If I was Richard Raffin, I would turn the lathe on low and hold this, but I'm not going to do that. So if you put this on and screw it tight, it gives you a really nice hold, and this is a great way to do a platter because the platter is not sticking out very far. The further you get away, then the more stresses and leverage you've got on it, and this is not as good a hold. But you can do this without too much problem. Now you can make that hold stronger a couple of ways. One is the strength comes not from the screw just holding it, but again, it's the surface here that's acting in a friction mode that this is registering against. So if we used a big washer like this, that will strengthen the hole. We can also use a hole that's not as deep for some projects, and it might still be adequate by putting a washer, sometimes two washers. The other way to get a strong hold is you make you a donut like this that is precisely the thickness of the outer depth of your normal jaws that's holding the woodworm screw. And that gives you this huge surface for this thing to register against. And when you get it on there, you know, it's going to be on there. So that's a good technique to make the woodworm screw hold for you. Yeah, I skipped a couple of safety things when we talked about fittings that I probably should mention. The best fit for determining whether or not you have, I know it must feel like I'm spraying information out of the turning fire hose, but all right, so this is a cutaway. The key is it's a good fit here when you can't get a piece of paper. There's no gap that you could put a piece of paper in. It ought to fit that snug. And if it's not that snug, then a couple of things. You didn't prepare the back of this to be perfectly flat. Perhaps with a slight concave into the base here, so it would register on the outside. It's just a bit proud, but you should not be able to get a piece of paper in there. Yeah, the other thing is don't crush the fibers. When you've got green wood and you got a tenon or recess, don't crank it so hard you crush the fibers. If you crush the fibers, then you're going to weaken the hole. Maybe not initially, only after if you've been turning a while. The other thing, when you're turning green wood, keep tightening it up, because you know, as the wood dries a little bit and the compression or expansion that you've got on those fibers does crush it a little bit, you've got to keep tightening it up. So tighten it up periodically. All right, some people have a problem with their jaws or their chuck. They get it on there and it doesn't easily come off. And this is a good example. This one I tend to hold down the spindle lock and pop it and it comes off without too much trouble. There are two solutions to that. The easiest solution is to do what John Jordan says. He says, you know, at the beginning of the day, put a little WD-40 and wipe down your lathe bed so everything slides. And by the way, wipe down the face of your spindle. And then you won't have this lock up. Now, other people, they think the solution is to put a nylon washer on there. Now, let me see if I can bring up that picture, and let me show you why that's a terrible idea. This is the Nova or Record Power or Robert Sorby micro dovetail on it that grabs a tenon. You make a parallel wall and that tiny, tiny little hawk tooth, so to speak, bites into the wood. They say, don't turn a groove there or you lose the strength. I haven't gotten to the washer yet, but that's the parallel tenon where it's biting in that little tiny micro dovetail. Now let me see if I can find that washer. Oh, here's another big way to hold a bowl with big bite. And we're going to talk about donut chucks briefly. This is when we get to turning the bottom of the bowl, finishing it off. Here's another way we're going to get to that. We'll get to that. We'll talk. Here's that mangled washer. So I was doing this demonstration for Gwinnett in a guy's shop. And he happened to have one of these washers. And I'd heard these things, these washers are supposed to be real good. The chuck will never lock up. And then I've heard other people say, yeah, but they're not machined like metal, so they can tend to introduce a little vibration. Where here's an example where in his use, he mangled this thing from normal use. And it squeezed that plastic and it's got this shard sticking out. I guarantee you that a chuck run against this thing will not run perfectly true, that there's going to be some vibration or tiny run out because this washer is not steel. And it's just so much better just to use a little bit of WD-40. There's another example of don't do a dovetail when you're supposed to have a parallel. And this shows you the same thing that photograph did, that if it's parallel jaws with that Nova, that tiny, you don't cut the groove, that tiny little tooth bites into it. Now I see Nova has since said, oh, we've got a great idea. We're going to have standard jaws that have a dovetail on the inside and the outside. How great are we? So they finally decided they're going to change their standard jaws. I thought that was kind of interesting because I kind of like the old ones, but I've been using them since day one, so I kind of got used to them. friction chucks. Let's talk about friction chucks a little bit. And I'm going to show you one example. It's not exactly a friction chuck, but it's, let me get this out of the way. But it's an interesting feature that I think I saw this in a book I got from Ernie Conover. How do you drill? We all know how you can drill on the lathe. We put a Jacobs chuck in here. If we use a Jacobs chuck, ideally it should have a drawbar on it if it's ever going to run by itself, because theoretically it could vibrate out and bad things happen, or it could get pulled out. Here's a golden goose. It's threaded for I think 1/4 inch by 20. So you put a drawbar to hold it. It keeps from vibrating out. But anyway, that's one way you could drill. You put the drill bit on there and you bring your tailstock and bring the work up like a tool handle into that spinning drill. Now, what if you wanted to drill a leg to a stool like the one I had here, like this? Okay, what if you wanted to drill that on a lathe? Maybe you didn't have a drill press. Well, there's a way to do that. Let me show you. You make something called a drill crotch pad. And basically it's just a disc, and ideally, well, not ideally, you turn a Morse taper to fit in here, and then you can put this right here and bring this into the spinning drill bit, and there you go. So I thought that was an interesting solution for a problem most people don't have. Specialty chucks, there's one. All right, here's an interesting one. I had a friend of mine that came to me one time with a problem. He's an engineer. He's restoring an automobile. He says, can you help me cut a piece of plexiglass in a perfect circle, but it can't have a hole in it. Now, if I use a hole saw, it'll have a hole in the middle. And I said, yeah, I can do that. So I did that by using a compression chuck, where basically you have looking for something to best illustrate that. This is not a perfect example, because this is really used for a pressure chuck, or maybe reversing a bowl, but this is giving an example. So I have, forget this, say this is not on here. I've just got this perfectly smooth wood face. And then I have another flat apparatus that fits on my live center, like I showed you, that you can make, that's perfectly flat. And you put the piece of plexiglass in here, bring up that other circular piece that's exactly the right size, like that, and then you come behind it, the side here, and just cut it off, and you got this perfectly round piece of plexiglass. Now, if that's not clear, let me show you one that's kind of a variation of that theme here. Okay, so I like turn chess pieces. I got to doing that recently, and here's an example. I turn those little felt pieces. I make those little felt pieces go on the bottom of them. So I take a strip of felt and I fold it up into, about a stack of about 6 deep. And then here's the compression chuck. I've got this flat piece of wood in the chuck, and then I've got the little compression piece. It's doesn't even have a Morse taper on it. Doesn't even really fit on the live center. It's just got this little dimple in it, but it's exactly the size I need. So I bring up the cone center into that little dimple and turn it into you could call it a friction chuck, but a compression chuck is probably a more technically correct term. And then you can come in here with a skew, and actually I found that a detail gouge works even better with a skew, but it's kind of humorous when I start cutting this stuff away. I start getting wrapped around the axle here in just a moment, because it doesn't cut all the way through cleanly, because you got a circle of stuff that's kind of flying around. But you get rid of the excess and then go back after it one more time. But it's just a way of, again, problem solving. How can you do something on the lathe that other people might do another way? But let me tell you, this is a whole lot better to get perfectly sized pads to fit a certain size chest piece than it is to cut them out with scissors. And there we go. Now we've got 6 of those perfectly sized. So that's a compression chuck. All right, let's talk about finishing, briefly talk about finishing a bowl, the bottom of a bowl. There's lots of ways to do it, and the standard way is to put the bowl between some type of driver like this. If it's perfectly flat, and this is actually recessed a little bit here, so it's, it's concave, put a piece of fun foam. This is closed cell foam from Michael's for about $1 a square. This could work on some small bowls, or you could turn one to match. Maybe if it's a large bowl and you want a lot of contact, you could use a contour gauge to inside the bowl to get that perfect fit. Just an example, just fit that contour of the bowl, and then you just turn this thing over, and that's the contour you're turning for your drive. And then you just turn away the nub with the tailstock brought up, and you just turn it down to a nub until you cut it off with a chisel or a flush cut saw. That's the way, most of us do, the most common way. But other ways are a donut chuck. Donut chuck we're talking about with different size rings, but you can make them, and this is one way to do it. It's just not one that I prefer. You got to have a different set of bolts and different size rings for different size bowls, and then you got to be able to, hopefully you've got a little dimple in there so you can center it with your tailstock. The other way to deal with it is to use a variation of somewhat of a variation of a set of cold jaws. That this is a scroll that you scroll and it tightens against the bowl, which is a big improvement over the cold jaws. That's what most folks call it, I think. But these work. Usually they come with a round bumper, but you can also buy these profiled bumpers, and they have a different angle on different sides to fit different bowls. So they're a lot more secure than the round rubber ones you might be familiar with. So this can be an effective solution. You can also use these plates to put wooden jaws on. So that's another justification. The one thing you want to keep in mind, and it says on here, maximum RPM 600. Again, this is not something, this is a finishing chucking mechanism just to finish the bare bones. And you're going to have tailstock support for as long as possible on most of these methods. And then you're going to pull it away just to get rid of that nubbing and for sanding and maybe adding a little texturing. But my fun way of doing it is the cool tool, and that's a vacuum chuck. Now, does everybody need a vacuum chuck? Probably not, but hey, what the heck? Sometimes it's about the fun toys, but this is a great way to do it. And I have a bunch of vacuum chucks that I made, and I made the vacuum system. And let me just show you an example of some of these chucks. I've got different sizes. I've got more. So it's got fun foam on it. You can see it's had some wear and tear. I got a big one and a little one, and I use those threaded blocks, and this is just MDF. This is cherry glued up and sealed with, you want to seal it with shellac or sanding sealer or epoxy or something so you reduce any leakage. But they just thread on different sizes for different size bowls. But let me just give you an example of how well this thing works. But this is what goes into your headstock. You can make these, but the guy that made these passed away. Nobody took over his business. But Craft Supply sells one of these things, this rotary adapter, at a cheaper price than I paid for this. It's got a couple of O-rings that give it a nice friction fit as it slides into the headstock. And I find this much preferable than these lamp rods that come all the way through that are more complicated to put on and put off. This works great. And with these O-rings, there is no leakage here. and you don't have to worry about it coming loose. It just spins. It's got at least 2 bearings in here to hold this thing, so it works great. So I just slide it on. Now, to give you a dramatic demonstration, let's just put this stool up here. The one I probably dropped on the floor. Yeah, it's the one I dropped on the floor. Let me bend over and get that. But bear with me here while I walk around. And you find the older you get, the more you drop things, and the harder it is to pick them up. So I have a couple of job aids for that. I have my magnetic pickup stick for tools and nuts and bolts, and I keep it right here. I find that very handy. And then I inherited this from my mother-in-law when she went into assisted living and didn't need it. These things where for wooden things or little things like blocks of wood that I drop, I use that. And it's just a whole lot easier than rooting around on my arms and knees. So this one doesn't have a pad on it, but this pad will work just fine. I salvaged this from a treadmill. All right, now I've got to thread it on. I need to do that so it won't leak. It won't come flying off. And actually, let me center this. I didn't do a very good job of centering it. I want to at least get it somewhat centered. And this is red oak, so red oak is fairly porous. Now I'm drawing 22 inches of mercury. Now if I get over here and grab this thing, it is not coming off easily. I might be able to jerk it off. There's no practical application for me turning a stool other than just dramatically show that it gives you a pretty strong hold. Now there's a lot of factors on how well that holds, and one is how well your system works and that you've sealed everything. The porosity of the wood, is it red oak, is it ingrain, does it have any ambrosia beetle tracks? I mean there's a lot of factors. The size of your pump, I've got a nice gas pump I picked up used off of eBay at a reasonable price. It's the same one they sell for about $600 at new at Packard and Craft Supply and Woodcraft. But it pulls 4.5 cubic feet per minute. You can get some smaller ones. I would say you want it to pull at least 4 cubic feet per minute. Don't buy some little Harbor Freight little pump, think you're going to be happy with it, because you won't. It needs to pull pretty good. But that's a great way to be able to finish. Again, it's a finishing way to hold something to finish off the bottom of a bowl blank. But because I don't have to mess with that threaded rod, I just slide this thing in. Let me see if I can give you some idea of what this thing looks like on the wall. I got a lot of other stuff here. Okay, so there's the pump on the wall. I use a French cleat system, so this thing just hangs on the wall. Then I've got the cord. I've got this, back I had a Commodore VIC-20 computer. Some of you might remember those days. That was the power switch I used for that. This thing didn't have a switch on it, so I used that for my on and off switch. That little reduce the air inflow right there, that's a filter got from Walmart for I think it's a brake line filter maybe. Then it's got this manifold situation here with this knob there. I turn that knob to let air in and out right there. And then that tells me how many inches of mercury I'm getting. If it's at 0, I'm in trouble, but if I get up close to 25, it's pretty strong. If I used a really thin bowl blank, I could crush it with this thing, or make it implode rather. So it's a fun tool, and it's very convenient. So it hangs right there on the wall. I can just reach out and grab it. Mandrels. We didn't really talk about mandrels. I'll go through some of that pretty quick. How do you turn a small piece of something? For example, this bovine ivory, and that means cow bone I stole from my dog. to make a little insert on this ebony knob? Well, you take that thing and you just cut off little slices. You drill a hole, kind of square it up best you can, and put it in CA, and then you can turn this thing and make these little buttons. That's one example. Another example, if you didn't have a small chuck, you could drill a hole into one of your spindle scraps and turn a small tenon on the blank between centers, and then glue it in there, and then you could make this a handle for something, or whatever. Just another way of dealing with it. It's all about problem solving and having fun doing it.
Really appreciate what you did here tonight, because I know I've only been turning 4 or 5 years, but there's you answered a lot of questions for me. I really appreciate what you did. Really appreciate your time. Where are you from? Where's your shop?
I'm in North Atlanta, in the suburbs, Sewanee, on the Chattahoochee River.
Okay, so you're on our time zone, but we do thank you so much. Anybody have any questions here?